With it seeming ever more likely that 2026 will mark Russell T Davies's final go as Doctor Who showrunner, I wanted to kind of do something a little bit different. I want to put together a list of 10 people who I think could actually succeed him as the next Doctor Who showrunner. Now this was actually harder than I was expecting it to be, because unlike with the Doctor, who can realistically be played by anyone at this point, the showrunner has historically been a harder role to fill, not only because it's one of the most demanding roles in television, but also because historically, the BBC have been a lot more selective as to who they choose for this part. Additionally, it's no secret that Doctor Who may be seen as a bit of a poison chalice in the industry at the moment, meaning that a lot of higher profile talent may shy away from taking on the challenge. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to keep it somewhat realistic with who could actually be on the list to take over, whilst also throwing in some fun options in there. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I talk to you about 10 people who could be the next Doctor Who showrunner. Also subscribe if you're new, that'd be greatly appreciated. We're trying to get to 30,000 subscribers and we're less than 400 away, and we do regular Doctor Who content here on the channel. So I've kind of decided to order this going from most realistic to least realistic. My kind of qualifiers for that are basically as follows. Do they have showrunning experience? This to me is one of the big things. Historically, every single showrunner we've had has had experience running a different show, whether it be Russell T Davies with Queer as Folk, whether it be Stephen Moffat with Coupling, or whether it be Chris Chibnall with Broadchurch. Precedent shows us that all three showrunners have had some level of showrunning experience prior, which means that it's likely something the BBC value. Now there is one or two options on this list that don't, but the vast majority of selections I've made for this do have some experience, either as a showrunner or executive producer. Number 2, I've tried to prioritize people who have at least somewhat experience with Doctor Who. Now, this is not a requirement in my mind, however, I do think it's something the BBC value. When you look at all three Doctor Who showrunners, all three have had experience with Doctor Who. Even Russell T Davies the first time around had written several Doctor Who novels. So it's clearly something the BBC value when it comes to selecting a showrunner. They want someone who has experience with the brand, who they feel confident can carry it forward. And number 3, this was my other kind of thing. I've kind of tried to veer away from massive names for showrunner, because there's a lot of people that get suggested that I just don't think would ever do it. People like Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Charlie Brooker, for example. Both very interesting choices, but both I would argue are way too big for Doctor Who and probably wouldn't take the risk. With Doctor Who showrunner, you need kind of someone experienced enough to take over the role and comfort the BBC that yes, this is going to be fine, but also someone who is not so big that Doctor Who would be seen as a step down for them. That might be kind of depressing to say, but I think that's just where we're at, you know, like you're not going to get some massive screenwriters on Doctor Who. Like, I don't think that's happening at the current moment. Not saying it could never happen again, but for right now, I don't think we're getting like huge titans to run the show. They have to be someone who is realistic, basically. And so with all that out of the way, let's go with the first option, which, if there was betting on who the next showrunner would be, I would class as the bookie's favourite. And that is Pete McTighe. You've probably heard this name thrown around a lot when it comes to next showrunner conversations, and that's because, in theory, he ticks all the boxes that have previously made a Doctor Who showrunner. He has a ton of experience with Doctor Who, whether it be writing episodes such as Kablam, Praxius, and Lucky Day. He will have showrunner experience, given that he is showrunning The War Between the Land and Sea, and he's not so big that the idea of taking on Doctor Who would be seen as a step down for him. You know, if anything, that would be seen as a promotion for him. So he kind of fits all three of my major criteria for next Doctor Who showrunner in terms of like likelihood. Now, I've said before, Pete McTighe would not be my first choice as showrunner. I haven't loved most of his scripts for Doctor Who thus far, and I would also make the case that I don't know whether he really has the unique vision for the show to carry it forward for the next couple of years. A lot of the stuff he has done has been very much in the kind of realm of fan service stuff, so things like Tales of the TARDIS and Blu-ray collection box sets, and while he's good at that kind of stuff, I don't know whether that's the type of vibe I want to see with Doctor Who going forward. I feel like we've had so much kind of fan service stuff at the moment that I don't really want to see much more of that, at least for the time being. With that being said though, I still think he's an incredibly likely candidate, and if I was to put my money anywhere, you know, if there was betting odds for Doctor Who showrunners, he would be the bookie's favourite 100%. Number 2, and this is one that I'm actually surprised more people haven't suggested, and that's Kate Herron. Now, Kate Herron might be a name you recognise, it might not be. She co-wrote the episode Rogue alongside her writing partner and collaborator, Brian E. Redman. But more interestingly for this analysis, she also was the executive producer on season 1 of Loki, which is a very high profile, obviously, show, and obviously, similarly to Doctor Who, revolves around things like time travel and all of this kind of stuff. So she has experience in this genre as a showrunner and as a writer. There is, of course, already an existing Doctor Who connection there. She's done all 3 jobs. She's done director, writer, and executive producer, so she does have an intimate knowledge of the television industry, and I wouldn't put it past her to have Brian E. Redman as a permanent co-collaborator, which would also be kind of interesting, seeing 2 people take on the job of showrunner rather than just one. Now, you might say that, well, would Doctor Who showrunner be seen as a step down for her, given she's already exec produced a Disney Plus show? And I can certainly see an argument for that. However, given that she agreed to write an episode of Doctor Who, it shows that she's not really necessarily above that. One thing that is worth considering, however, is that she is set to be the director and writer for the upcoming The Sims movie with Margot Robbie, which I had no idea was even a thing, but given that that'll probably be quite a big project, that may make her somewhat more unlikely to take on a job like Doctor Who showrunner. However, I still think she's relatively up there in terms of a frontrunner, and I'm kind of surprised more people haven't suggested her. In terms of tonally, I could imagine her kind of going more in a kind of romantic angle, quite similar to RTD1, given that both of her projects that I've seen, obviously Loki season 1 kind of revolves around the 2 Lokis kind of falling in love, and then obviously with Rogue as well, obviously you have the Doctor falling in love with Rogue as well, so love does seem to permeate a lot of her kind of writing and works, which maybe might not be what a lot of people would necessarily want for Doctor Who moving forwards. From what I've seen, a lot of people kind of tend to think that they want something a bit darker, you know, a bit more serious, so maybe she wouldn't be ideal for that. But in terms of the BBC criteria that I laid out, I feel like she ticks all those boxes. Number 3, J. Michael Straczynski. This is probably one of the other names that you've heard associated with being the next Doctor Who showrunner, and that's because J. Michael Straczynski himself has said that he'd love to do the job, which automatically saying that does put you in pretty good stead to take it, just because of how few people actually seem to want this job. He's definitely one of the more high-profile people we have on these lists, with him being the writer and executive producer on things like Babylon 5 and Sense8. Obviously, I mainly know him from his work in comics, specifically his run on The Amazing Spider-Man. So he's got a very, very, you know, kind of illustrious background when it comes to the entertainment industry, and an intimate knowledge of sci-fi, and he's also a Doctor Who fan, which would be very, very useful. Interestingly, with J. Michael Straczynski, though, he is an American, and you might say, well, is that relevant? And I would say somewhat yes, because historically, the showrunner has always been British, and I do think that that might be something that the weird traditional BBC may value somewhat. However, it's worth noting that he recently did move to the UK for other work. So if the job required him to work in the UK, he would be able to do that. His relative outsider status and lack of experience with Doctor Who in specific may put him down on the list of likelihood somewhat. However, I definitely think he's one of the most experienced people who has actually shown an interest in being Doctor Who showrunner that we have, so I think it would be silly for me not to include him on this list. I could imagine his run being a bit more hard sci-fi than we've had for New Who thus far, which I think might be actually quite a nice sort of contrast to Russell going in the more fantasy and god direction for his second era. Next up, we have Jack Thorne. Now, Jack Thorne's also a name that I've mentioned a couple of times, and that's because he actually was suggested in a recent Doctor Who Reddit leak, which obviously take those with a grain of salt, but the fact that his name had been thrown around does kind of put him with a bit more of a chance. He's probably one of my personal favourite candidates that I've seen suggested, purely because of his body of work being so incredibly well received. Obviously, he's done things like Adolescence, Toxic Down with Jodie Whittaker, and he has sci-fi experience with his Dark Materials. Obviously, like with JMS, he doesn't have Doctor Who experience, which may make him somewhat less likely. However, given that his Dark Materials was a Bad Wolf joint, if he was chosen, he would at least have experience with them, assuming Bad Wolf did stay on, which, I mean, they could and they also could not. We don't really know that yet. I could definitely imagine, given Jack Thorne's previous work, that his run on Doctor Who would be somewhat darker and maybe a little bit more adult, which is something that I would personally like to see. There is a worry, though, with Jack Thorne that, like with some of the other names I didn't include in this list, that it would be seen as a step down for him as a writer and as an executive producer. However, I wanted to include him given how much conversation there'd been around him thus far. Number 5, and here we get to some old reliable names that you will have almost certainly heard in the conversation for Doctor Who showrunner, Toby Whithouse. Now, this has been one of my personal choices for a very, very long time, and someone who is very, very familiar with Doctor Who. He has showrunner experience with his show Being Human for BBC 3, and also his comedy series No Angels for Channel 4. He has plenty of Doctor Who experience with School Reunion, The Vampires of Venice, The God Complex, A Town Called Mercy, Under the Lake Before the Flood, and The Lie of the Land. He also wrote the Torchwood episode, Greeks Bearing Gifts. So a lot of Doctor Who pedigree and background. It is worth saying that he hasn't worked on Doctor Who in a while, which may make him somewhat less likely compared to someone maybe like Pete McTighe or Kate Herron. However, it's worth saying that when Chris Chibnall was appointed as showrunner, he hadn't written a story since the late Smith era. So it's not impossible for someone to take the job who hasn't worked on the show in a little bit of a while. And like with Chibnall, he does have showrunner experience on a critically successful show. His Doctor Who sort of episodes are a bit of a mixed bag by fans. I really love School Reunion. The Vampires of Venice is kind of seen as okay. I really love Town Called Mercy and Under the Lake. And then the other two you've got God Complex, which is also pretty good, and The Lie of the Land, which I think is, a bit of a mixed bag as well. So maybe not the strongest candidate, but certainly one that I would be interested to see what he did with it. Looking at his Doctor Who work, he seems to take on a lot of the more esoteric and weird scripts for Doctor Who, things like the God Complex and, The Lie of the Land and all this kind of stuff. So maybe that's what he would do as Doctor Who showrunner, maybe something a little bit more out there and a little bit more weird as well. Another thing that's interesting about Toby Whithouse in specific is that I believe he was previously offered the role of Doctor Who showrunner, but turned it down on the basis that he was only offered it as kind of a temporary position. And I believe, and I'll double check the sources for this, that he was only offered it for about a year or two. And he kind of said, well, if I'm going to do it, I want it on a permanent basis, which is fair enough. And he has been creating several things for the BBC for the last few years, including Noughts and Crosses for BBC One, and The Game for BBC Two. So in total, he has BBC experience, Doctor Who experience, showrunner experience, which I think automatically kind of bolstered him up as a choice, and he's expressed interest in the role before. Number 6, another one of my personal favourites. We've got Jamie Mathieson. Now, Jamie Mathieson is one of my favourites. His 3 scripts that he's done are Mummy on the Orient Express, Flatline, and Oxygen, all 3 of which were fan favourites of the Peter Capaldi era. And like with the likes of Jack Thorne, his scripts do tend to have a bit of a darker tinge to them, which is something that I personally have really wanted for a while. He also did The Girl Who Died as well, which is probably his weakest, but even then, I would say that that's a pretty good run overall. Like with Toby Whithouse, he does have the issue and drawback of not having worked on the show in a while, although as I've said before, that doesn't necessarily rule people out, given how long it had been since Chibnall wrote it, and even longer in Russell's case as well. He's also a former stand-up comedian, meaning that he might be able to kind of deliver that kind of humour that maybe Doctor Who's been missing. I'm imagining stuff kind of similar to City of Death, maybe a bit of a modern Douglas Adams, which would be very, very cool. The one thing that is a drawback, though, for Jamie Mathieson is that I don't believe he has showrunner experience. He did write for Being Human, which was also Toby Whithouse's project that we mentioned earlier, but as far as I can tell, he hasn't showrun a show solo before. So maybe that would put him down a bit in terms of likelihood for next Doctor Who showrunner. But I think with a record like this, they'd be silly not to at least give him a call. Next up, we have someone else who you've probably also heard thrown around before. I decided to put Sally Wainwright on the list. Now, the main reason I put Sally Wainwright on the list are mainly twofold. Obviously, very much an experienced producer on TV shows, on things like Gentleman Jack and Renegade Nell and Happy Valley, all three of which were very well received. Last Tango in Halifax as well. She is also a known friend of Russell T Davies, and I believe she was even given a tour of Wolf Studios at one point as well. So she has a familiarity with that team. But the other reason why I've kind of put her on the list is that she was another one that had been rumored previously. So I'm kind of using that as maybe a little bit of something that could swing the odds in her favor. The one major issue with Sally Wainwright, and I will have to see if I can find this, but I don't believe she's a massive sci-fi fan, which might maybe make her a bit of a poor choice to run a sci-fi show. However, with that having been said, it's worth saying that a lot of writers on Doctor Who don't necessarily start out with a sci-fi background, but end up coming to love the genre. So I'm putting her on here mainly because of her incredibly well-received previous works, her personal friendship with Russell T Davies, and her previously being rumoured before. I have to be honest, I'm not super familiar with her work, so I can't exactly tell you what her kind of vibe for Doctor Who would be. I've watched a bit of Happy Valley, and that was very good, but obviously it's not really directly transferable onto Doctor Who. Her work does seem to very much kind of revolve around female leads, so it's possible that she would pick a female Doctor, which would be very interesting. I'd love to see, if we were going to get another female Doctor, I'd love to see a female Doctor written by a female showrunner. I think that would be very interesting. But yeah, I think she's one worth considering, if only because of her pedigree. Next up, I'm going to go with someone who I kind of ummed and ahed over in terms of putting on this list or not. But given that she's another one that people have suggested before, and she's got a Doctor Who track record, I thought I'd mention her here, and that is Maxine Alderton. Now, you might remember her from the Jodie Whittaker era. She co-wrote the episodes Haunting of Villa Diodati and Village of the Angels, which were two of the more warmly received episodes of the Chris Chibnall era. She seems to have more of a gothic horror edge to her in both of her scripts, which would be a very interesting direction to take the show. She's definitely seen as a highlight of the Chibnall era, however, she does have two major issues. One, she, as far as I know, hasn't ran a show before, which might make it more difficult for her to make that transition. And it might be something where the BBC is a little bit hesitant to give her the role because of that. But also, perhaps more damningly, she hasn't actually written a story that's fully her own, in the sense that both stories she's written have been co-written and have been involved in series arcs of Chris Chibnall. So I think before you'd even consider her a showrunner realistically, we'd have to see what a story of hers would be like without the co-writing of Chris Chibnall or anyone else. I want to see what Maxine Alderton could do purely on her own, and then, you know, if that episode is also really good, then I think that would kind of bolster her chances quite significantly. She hasn't written for the show since the Jodie era, which again, you know, as I've said before, maybe they'd like to go with someone who is more of a frequent collaborator. However, given the reception of her episodes being probably the warmest in that entire era, she's worth considering, I think. And I mean, maybe the BBC would be willing to take more of a risk, given, as I said before, I think they are going to struggle for people who are willing to take on this job. And finally, my 10th and final selection is Stephen Moffat. Nah, only joking. I did consider putting him on here as a joke, just because of the fact that Russell came back, but I honestly don't think Stephen Moffat would do it again, and quite honestly, I don't think that's what the show needs right now. Stephen Moffat ran the show for an incredibly long time, and I don't actually think he would be a great choice to carry it forward. But my 10th and final choice is very closely associated to Stephen Moffat, and that's Mark Gatiss. Now, Mark Gatiss is an interesting one because he has worked on Doctor Who a lot, not only as a writer, but also as an actor. With a total of 9 Doctor Who credits, he was also the co-creator of Sherlock with Stephen Moffat, alongside Dracula, giving him that, you know, showrunner experience that the BBC would like. Mark Gatiss is definitely one of the safest pairs of hands you could possibly give the show to, but the reason I've put him near the bottom is that he already has quite a celebrated career, and I don't necessarily know whether going back to Doctor Who would be the top of his priority list at the present moment. It's also worth saying that in my personal opinion, he might be a bit too similar to Stephen Moffat, given how close collaborators they are and how similar their writing styles often are as well. His Doctor Who credits are also a bit of a mixed bag. You've got Unquiet Dead, which is pretty good, but I don't think it's anyone's favourite in Series 1. The Idiot's Lantern, which I don't think is great. Victory of the Daleks, Same Again. Night Terrors, which I actually really like. Cold War, which is okay. Crimson Horror, which I actually think is underrated, but I know that's not the common opinion. Robot of Sherwood, again, okay. And then Sleep No More, which is ooh. And then Empress of Mars, which is also okay. So a bit of a mixed bag. I don't think Mark Gatiss is ever really seen as like the highlight of any of the series he works in when it comes to Doctor Who in specific. However, the same was also true of Chris Chibnall, and he still did get the job. So it's worth considering that. He is one of the most experienced people they could get. He has an intimate knowledge of the brand. I think, though, my issue with him, kind of similarly to McTighe, is I feel like he's too close to what we've already had. You know, I almost feel like I already know what a Mark Gatiss era of Doctor Who would look like. However, if I'm looking at it purely from the BBC's perspective, he might actually be more likely, and maybe I should have bolstered him up a bit, but I kind of wanted to go for some more, you know, out there and fun picks. But that wraps up my 10 picks for who I think could be Doctor Who Showrunner. I just realised while editing this that I technically only did 9 choices, given that I made Stephen Moffat basically a joke choice. So before anyone says that I actually only did 9, I'm going to chuck in one of my other kind of curveball options, and that's Nicholas Briggs. Nicholas Briggs obviously might seem like a weird choice because he's never written for TV, but he has written tons of Big Finish and is the executive over there as well. So he does have executive and producing experience, even though it's not in television. He's incredibly entrenched into the brand, and obviously, you know, he voices half of the monsters as well. So he's very much an old hand when it comes to Doctor Who in specific. I think he would be a very safe pair of hands to guard the brand in the same way that like a Mark Gatiss would be. My only real thing with him is that I've never really seen him as like my favorite writer. There'll be some stories of his I absolutely love on Big Finish. There are others I think that are just okay, but he does have a ton of experience writing Doctor Who and just Doctor Who related stuff in general. So I'll put him in as an honorable mention. So there you go. There's your 10. So no one comment that now. And now again, these aren't necessarily people who I want. I mean, there are a couple that I think would be really interesting, but they're people who I think would be likely and willing to do it, and also have the kind of backing and credentials to actually take on the job of showrunner. It's very possible that the next showrunner is none of these, and if it isn't, then I will be incredibly excited to see who on earth they pick. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Who do you think will be the next showrunner? Is there someone who I didn't put in this video who you think would be a shoo-in for the next showrunner? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If this video gets 500 likes, I will do a sequel going over 10 actors who I think could play the next Doctor. So if you enjoyed this one, like it and I'll do a sequel. Thanks all for watching. Feel free to subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.